Um, I should just start by saying really that this paper is really the beginning of some research we've been undertaking for almost a year now. We've been looking in conjunction with a Chinese agricultural firm actually who commissioned us to do this work at whether this sort of vision that we hear a lot about and we see a lot about and excites our students and a lot of us as practitioners as well, whether it's actually achievable. If it's not achievable, what might need to change to actually make that a possibility? Now, we realise it's not a new concept. Many people have been talking about this for quite a long time. Possibly 20 years or so, people have been expressing visions of what a vertical farm might be. Interesting, actually, I was having a quick chat to Anthony Wood earlier. He's one of my former colleagues, and he reminded me that I think 10 years ago he ran a student project for a vertical farm. So I think he just wanted to remind me that what we're doing is not very new, which we did realise. And there are some practical examples that have been constructed now. I'm aware of one or two in the UK, there's a few in the US, and one or two others dotted around the world. At relatively small scale, using or implementing technology at different levels, but people out there trying this and sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, but actually enabling us and informing us to giving us lessons really about where we might move to in the future. Now, I also want to really issue a bit of a disclaimer here. I'm not really here to preach to you that vertical farms are necessarily the future. I'm not here to sort of make claims that this is the only solution for the future of agriculture and feeding the population, and I'm definitely not here to suggest this is the best solution, but it is something that's interesting. As I said earlier, it does excite a lot of us. It provides an interesting proposition, an interesting possibility for the future of how we might feed some of the world's increasingly urban population. Now, from an academic perspective, we clearly started out on this research, and my PhD student who's working on the project is sitting here as well, so I'm very grateful to him for this work. But we were quite happy as academics to prove that this is a pretty stupid idea, actually. If that was something we found out, then we thought that was quite valid and valuable. But clearly, as we've been undertaking the research, we've started to realise that actually it is a possibility. It is achievable, but a few things might need to change over the coming years for us to see it being developed more frequently. Sorry, to get the technology. Now, the presentation itself is basically structured into four very simple parts. I won't dwell on that, quite obvious. I suppose the starting point for a lot of this is that we're all aware, I'm sure, that currently there's a number of really serious issues that are affecting agriculture and food production around the world. Some of these are exacerbated in certain regions more than others, but they're things we're all aware of and we see regularly in the press. Global food security, a really hot topic amongst many of my colleagues in other disciplines. How do we feed the current world's population and the projected world's population? Massive issue, massive challenge for us. Food miles, increasingly around the world we're concerned about how far the food travels to our table. We increasingly we like to buy locally produced produce. And again, this is becoming an increasing challenge as cities are growing, expanding, sprawling. That food that's being produced is moving further away from the populations. The quality of food as well, issues of contamination. Can we trust the food that we eat these days? Again, in different parts of the world, we're commonly seeing items in the press about the quality of the produce we're consuming, and clearly that's a growing issue. Also, and again, I'm sure you're all aware, we're increasingly suffering from less agricultural land. Developments eating up the agricultural land where we produce the food. Deserts are taking over agricultural land. The quality of the land that's available is depleting as well as it's being over-farmed and so on. So these are some of the many justifications for why we might want to start and consider the opportunity of growing more produce in the city, and vertical farms being possibly one solution to doing that. Population, as we know, we've heard a lot about this over the last few days. Populations are still growing quite rapidly. Current sort of reliable predictions are telling us that there'll be around just under 8.5 billion people in 2050. and somewhere in the region of 10 billion by 2100. So we're talking about a growing population, and again, as we've seen in many presentations over the last couple of days, that this is an increasingly urbanized population as well. So many of those issues about food production I've just mentioned on the previous slide are actually going to be increasingly important to us. And obviously that will put increasing strain on the production of food and the need for it as well. I mentioned about sort of areas for agriculture decreasing, farmland being increasingly occupied by development and so on. It's estimated we currently need about another 120 million hectares of farmland, or else about 370 million people could face famine by 2050, which is an incredible number. I mean, just for me, from a UK perspective, this is 6 times the population of the UK could be suffering from famine within just a few years' time if we can't produce more food. Now, there are, and this was something that cropped up yesterday, and it made me think a little bit. There was talk about, if we can make cities increasingly denser, can they actually shrink in size? Yeah, quite possibly. Could that then lead to more agricultural land? I don't know. Maybe that's something we could think about as well. Is it realistic? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly it's a possibility. Deforestation, another interesting, we're all aware of the impacts of deforestation on climate change, global warming and so on. And ironically, the most direct reason for deforestation is actually to create more agricultural land. It's not, as most people think, logging and just producing timber and so on, which actually only accounts for, I think, somewhere around 8, just under 10% of actually deforestation that's happening around the world. So again, producing food in other manners, in other ways, actually gives us an opportunity to sort of start and tackle the issues about deforestation that has the ongoing then impacts in terms of climate change and so on that we're aware of. Conventional agriculture still obviously has a big role to play and will have a big role to play for a long time, but there are many sort of issues related to this as well. Monocultures eroding biodiversity, pesticides, fertilizers polluting the environment, soil being eroded, water being consumed at unsustainable rates, massive inputs of fossil fuels, and really there's a limit to how much more intensively we can produce crops. So again, another reason that we might need to think about other solutions for how we produce our food. Just a little bit on the vertical farm concept. What actually is it? Interestingly, I suppose when we talk about a vertical farm, we're not necessarily talking about really tall buildings. We've seen a lot over the last few days of buildings going hundreds, 1,000 meters into the sky. We're probably not talking about that in terms of a vertical farm. In fact, in some respects, a simple definition, I guess, could be a farm that occupies more than one level even. I mean, 2 stories would be a vertical farm, I suspect. But that's probably not what we're really looking at here. They can consist of different scales of activity as well. A lot of people have suggested to me as we've been doing this work that actually they see the most likely possibility of vertical farming being perhaps certain zones on the perimeters of high-rise buildings. Certainly could be one possible solution. We see vertical farms as being or needing to be self-sustainable, that they're controlled loops, closed loops in terms of their environment, where really the only thing, we would like to think the only thing that would leave a vertical farm would be the produce, that everything else, all the byproducts and so on, could be actually recycled within the process. Benefits, I probably don't need to sort of be too explicit about these. A lot of them relate to the issues and challenges I mentioned a few minutes ago. Clearly, vertical farms give us the opportunity to save land. We can produce crops around all year round. We don't have issues in terms of severe weather. Problems with agricultural runoff. They can use a lot less water. We can recycle water that's produced within the development, or even in other local developments as well. Could come into this. Gives us opportunities to repair damaged ecosystems. Creates new employment opportunities. And again, this might lead to some thoughts about where they're actually located, which I'll come back to a little bit later, actually. And also, it gives us opportunities to control quality, but also produce other products, biofuels, plant-derived drugs, and so on, that are all necessary. Transportation costs, another one. Increasingly producers and consumers are very much concerned about the impact of transportation costs on the cost of products. And if we can get the produce being produced more locally, then obviously this lessens the impact on that, the associated pollution issues and so on. Now, I mentioned this sort of closed loop system, which is one of the things we've been focusing on a little bit recently. The idea of this closed loop where all things happen within the building or the buildings of a vertical farm. For example, CO2 loops that could be self-contained within buildings. Interestingly, we've not limited this just to crops. We've also looked at livestock, and I'll talk again about this in a few minutes. It's not necessarily we're suggesting this, but it's something we wanted to include as part of our research to understand the potential implications of that. Also, really, we're talking about, as I said, these closed loops, three key loops: the CO2 loop, a water loop, quite an obvious one, quite an easy one to solve, and also an energy loop. And as I mentioned earlier, the aim being that actually we keep everything in the building apart from the thing that can go out there and be consumed. Just to, I think as architects we always like a few images of designs and buildings, but just a few images of some people's ideas of what a vertical farm might be over the last few years. And you see these, as Anne mentioned, in all the journals. I'd encourage a lot of you to go and look at the student projects that are out on the wall as well, actually, the exhibition out there, which is quite interesting. And there's a number of vertical farms or similar types of scheme there. Commonly, we're seeing things like sky gardens now in an awful lot of high-rise buildings. Someone out there's, I think, proposed a vertical forest, and I saw a scheme, I think in Italy recently, for a vertical forest. Interesting concept, and I think it's important that architects are always pushing the boundaries, really. So a lot of these might not be achieved in this form, but certainly we're exploring and understanding why or why not in terms of these particular projects. So some of these projects, I'll go through these relatively quickly, actually, but they all have some quite interesting and sometimes quite innovative ideas. This one in particular has things like reflective edges to try and bounce light further into the building, LEDs providing light for the plants, which can compensate for the lack of daylight and actually provide better quality of light in terms of plant growth, actually, but obviously at more cost. Angled floors that help the collection of water and recycling of water, and thinking carefully about the floor-to-ceiling heights to try and maximise daylight potential but still keep it within some realms of economic viability. Another one where the ventilation's been considered very carefully as part of the project, and the water recycling system. Another one here, which is really fully operated in terms of artificial lighting and using large quantities of drums to actually cultivate the produce. Another one, very tall one here, maximising the use of natural light, taking a very small plot, and using the core of the building to deliver recyclable water. And another one, one of the interesting things as well, the idea of mixed use. This might be very speculative because I'm not totally convinced that I think vertical farms and other functions are compatible, but I think the sort of real estate issues in terms of the quality of structure and spaces created might cause some contradictions there. And I think personally where we're looking realistically to build a vertical farm may not be where we can attract office tenants and possibly residential use. But certainly, again, it's interesting to think about what other functions might be compatible with mixed use vertical farms. Could workers' housing be associated with it? Clearly, things like sort of a retail element, a market element, a wholesale element, obviously would be a component of it. So there's certainly some things that could lead to a sort of certain element of mixed use within a vertical farm environment. Oops, sorry. Some other projects, these are some of the projects that our students have been producing. Actually, Phil Oldfield, who's here, is one of the supervisors for a number of these projects. And again, I think it's important that students are good opportunities to test out some of these ideas, actually. Their thinking is very innovative, it's not constrained, and actually at the start of some sort of new venture, new possibility, new paradigm, that's what we really need. We need free thinking. And obviously a lot of that would then be tamed down in terms of the realization of projects. But if we don't start from that perspective, then where will we get to? This one, interesting actually, this is talking of livestock. This project was actually about fish farming. And what was quite interesting, they in this project had this closed loop in terms of the water, so you could basically collect rainwater, recycle it, take the water from the fish farms itself, and actually then purify that and feed back through the system. And actually, even in this small project, the estimations were that over 300,000 fish could be grown, produced annually, which is actually quite significant in a relatively small project. So we can actually achieve quite high returns in terms of produce. Technology I don't want to dwell on too long. I've got a few slides in here just to sort of give you some thoughts really, I suppose, but I don't want to dwell on it for too long because actually the technology is all out there. It's all available. It is improving. It is being refined. Some of it's very expensive at the moment, but actually costs are coming down and the efficiency is going up. But actually anything we might need to produce a vertical farm actually does exist in terms of technology. Different ways of producing crops, I suspect we're going to be looking at. We're probably not looking at soil-intensive production within a vertical farm for various issues, various reasons. Hydroponics offers some very interesting possibilities in terms of being very productive, very intensive, and producing quality crops, and so on. Aeroponics and aquaponics, all relatively new ideas, but actually, when I talk to researchers in agriculture and biochemistry and these other areas, this is all quite advanced stuff actually. They know what they're doing, they know how they can produce these things. It's just not necessarily being done on a really wide scale at the moment. And certainly when we start talking about introducing some of these methods into buildings, this is the way we need to be thinking. Light's an obvious issue. Plants obviously grow better when they've got natural light on the whole. Certainly historically that's the case. And certainly most plants will struggle to grow in very dark areas, which then you start to think about footprints of buildings and so on, or introducing technologies that enable us to use LEDs and so on. But then obviously there's different cost implications that come into play. Various ways we can get light, natural light into the building. Light shelves in terms of obviously reflecting, and other ways of delivering as well, like light rods, light pipes, fiber optics, all the things that actually are being used in architecture around the world for other functions already. So I don't want to dwell too long on these parts. As I say, the technology is actually out there. We can, as I mentioned, supplement artificial light, which actually can lead to better growth as well, actually, because we know we can control the quality of the light as well, the type of light that the plants need. Different methods for actually growing. I just want to sort of move through some of these quite quickly. Cladding materials, ETFE, probably quite an ideal, relatively cheap solution, cost efficient, good thermal properties, etc., that we're all aware of. There are issues, obviously, as we start to go taller in terms of its use, though, that might be restrictive in terms of that as a material for cladding our buildings. The opportunities to supplement CO2 provision to plants. We know that photosynthesis increases as we increase the parts per million of CO2 within the environment. And again, a vertical farm offers us the opportunity to do that. Promotion strategies is probably one of the things that interests me a little bit more, actually. One of the key things for us, one of the key things we're going to be working on next, really, is the sort of return on investment. This is actually some work that was done just a few years ago by Gordon Graff, looking at the sort of financial viability of a project. He did some calculations based on a 10-story, 35 meters by 35 meter building, which he estimated to have a capital budget of around $110 million US dollars. He calculated at that time, for that type of produce with that sort of technology, that the return on investment was coming in at around 8%, which is probably sort of lower than a lot of investors, a lot of developers might want. And it does help to explain why so far vertical farms are relatively few and far between, and certainly not appearing on any sort of scale that we might wish to see. And I say the next stage of our work is really to start and look at this in a lot more detail, because I think there's a lot more that needs to be taken into account than was taken into account in these particular figures. And we're planning to sort of work with colleagues in economics who are working on things like global food security, just to look at the sort of detail of this. Because if we can't make it stack up financially, the only way it's going to work is with someone subsidising this very heavily. And that might be something that happens in certain countries or certain cities, but on the whole, it's not going to happen to a large degree. And we'll be looking very carefully at things like location and rental returns and technologies used, crop types produced, in terms of yield, profitability, and so on. And obviously, all of these factors will be a key part of whether we actually are able to achieve this concept in the future. Crop selection is quite critical as well. I suspect we're not going to be producing every type of crop. Some are more, I suppose it's the same, some crops are more amenable to being grown within indoor environments. Some are more profitable than others. Some can be grown more intensively than others. So it will dictate what crops aren't and are grown. I talked earlier a little bit about the livestock issue as well, which I said I'd come back to. And I think clearly farming livestock within a building is going to create a lot of issues and a lot of objections in many parts of the world in terms of animal well-being and so on and so forth. In terms of our research, we wanted to almost not turn a blind eye to that, because obviously it's very significant and that might jeopardize some of those issues. Quite probably, almost certainly, will jeopardize this happening in certain parts of the world, but we wanted to actually still examine what the possibilities were, because it was important to us to understand the issues, the challenges, and the opportunities in terms of that as well. So I don't want to stress that too much, because I'm sure there are people in here who, even in this room, who probably get quite wound up by that as a possibility. But we thought it was important as in our research to consider it. Policy support, another big thing that's either going to stop vertical farms being achieved or actually help them. I'm sure some governments will be more supportive than others. Some of those might have bigger challenges in terms of feeding their populations. Some might want to be at the cutting edge of this sort of technology. Clearly, opportunities to facilitate this as a development typology include things like including within sustainable development strategies or policies. There could be initiatives to promote certainly growth of produce within cities, not necessarily just within buildings, but within cities, and that could help to push the move towards creating vertical farms. There may, and I suspect will, need to be some sort of subsidization of initial projects. And that's why I suspect countries like China might be some of the initiators of some of these projects, because of the issues they have in terms of urbanization, population growth, and also actually the forward thinking of some of the government's officials and so on. Also, the need for support to develop research further. What we're doing at the moment is a relatively small-scale funded project. We need more support in terms of education, in terms of the research, and also opportunities to actually practice this and try it. And our hope is that there are opportunities out there to try perhaps smaller-scale pilot projects where we can test out viability, test out different technologies to come up with more appropriate solutions. Social acceptance, again, I think you probably know all of this, but I mentioned at the beginning this desire to have food that's more locally produced, to be able to be sure about the quality of the products we're consuming. Generally, people are more aware now and more keen to see us recycling, us reusing water and so on, and this is something that's spreading and I think will help us in terms of the ideas of promoting vertical farms. Putting here new iconic structures. I'm not sure vertical farms are going to be iconic structures, actually. I think they will be innovative, they'll be new, there'll be a new typology. I'm not sure they're going to be iconic, but certainly they could be new interventions, new insertions into the cityscape. And also they'll obviously create new employment opportunities. And just to sort of conclude here, I think for me, as I said at the beginning, I started out trying to be quite open-minded about this as a possibility, but I think inevitably I've probably got a little bit caught up in the excitement, as most people do when they start considering sort of new building typology. And clearly there is an opportunity here for us to create innovative new solutions that can be integrated into our urban areas. Design, we can clearly do it. I'm sure there's a lot of other practitioners out there. We can design vertical farms. We can do low tech, high tech, whatever's actually needed. That capability is clearly there. The technologies are there, as I mentioned. Cost effectiveness, clearly there's some way to go still, but I suspect when we start looking at this quite carefully, we're going to find that there are certain places where this becomes, if not cost effective, very near to it, actually. And that's the thing I'm quite excited about next. Can we actually prove that this can be a viable proposition for developers, for agricultural producers, and so on? Social acceptance, I think in some ways this will be, it is an acceptable thing for the public, I think, but that will vary depending on what is being produced within these buildings. Promotion, a key thing actually, that we need government support to actually promote this. And we do need those pilot schemes out there that people can test, we can explore, and we can use to promote this as a concept to others. So I'll finish with that. Thank you very much.